What's worse than facing a medieval army in battle? Surviving it. Victory songs and heraldic banners might tell one story, but for the man who crawled off the field with torn flesh and shattered bone, the war was far from over. The real enemy waited in the shadows, not in steel armor, but in the form of fever, infection, and the cruel indifference of a world with no real understanding of how the human body worked. For every soldier who fell in combat, many more endured an aftermath so brutal it felt like a punishment for having lived. The fate of the wounded revealed a hidden truth about medieval life that rarely makes it into the pages of chivalric romance. The chronicles celebrated kings, knights, and the glory of campaigns, but left out the stink of blood drying on the skin, the relentless ache of broken bones, and the weeks or months of agony that followed. Some soldiers found salvation in rare acts of mercy or in the hands of the few skilled healers. Others discovered that survival meant entering a different kind of hell, one where each day became a gamble with death. On the battlefield, help came. Fast if it came at all, but what awaited was not the clean, careful precision of a modern operating theater. Instead, it was an arsenal of tools that looked more like the instruments of a torturer. Long knives sharpened until they gleamed in the sun, heavy bone saws with teeth meant to bite deep, iron probes to search for splinters of metal, and fire always. Fire. To the wounded, these objects meant the difference between life and death, though often the line blurred into a haze of pain and delirium. Fire, in particular, held a grim place of honor among medieval healing arts. A heated blade or rod could close a bleeding wound in seconds, the sizzling hiss marking the moment flesh was sealed. The smell of burnt skin lingered in the air long after the screaming stopped, something soldiers swore they could still smell months later, as if their bodies remembered. To the surgeons, this was efficiency. To the wounded, it was a memory carved into their nerves. In some cases, the glowing metal was applied not just to stop bleeding, but to ward off imagined corruptions in the wound, though no one knew exactly why it sometimes worked. This was not the work of carefully trained physicians with years of scholarly study. More often, it was done by whoever in the army had the sharpest tools and the nerve to use them. The battlefield surgeon was rarely a gentle figure. He was a man who had learned, through grim necessity, to push aside hesitation and do whatever it took to keep a soldier breathing, at least until the next sunrise. The fact that this surgery often resembled the work of a blacksmith hammering and shaping hot metal was no coincidence. In both cases, the material had to be forcibly altered to achieve a result, except here, the metal was living flesh. To a soldier, the terror wasn't always in the moment of injury, it was in the knowledge of what would follow. Men went into battle knowing that a wound was not just a mark of bravery, but an invitation to a trial of fire, steel, and pain. Sometimes in the still moments before battle, they'd glance at the camp's medical tent and wonder if that was where they'd end up by nightfall, staring at the same tools that had maimed as often as they had saved. And so, on those grim days after the clash of armies, the true cost of survival began to unfold, one cauterized wound, one agonizing breath at a time. In the dim, chaotic world of medieval medicine, survival often hinged on remedies discovered by accident rather than design. One of the more curious examples was the use of boiled wine to clean wounds. Surgeons had no understanding of bacteria or sterilization, yet they noticed that injuries rinsed with steaming wine seemed to heal better than those washed in cold water. They believed this had nothing to do with invisible microbes. Concepts like germs were centuries away, but rather that the wine's heat or its purity kept away foul vapors and malignant spirits. In truth, the alcohol killed some of the infection-causing agents, but to medieval minds, it was a battle against bad air. These beliefs were rooted in the ancient theory of miasma, that disease drifted on the breeze, carried by noxious odors. When soldiers fell sick after battles, the blame went to the corrupted air of the battlefield, or, in more superstitious circles, to the wrath of unseen spirits angered by bloodshed. The idea that the danger might be hidden in the dirt on an arrowhead, or in the unwashed hands of the man treating you, never crossed their minds, and yet, despite their flawed reasoning, some of their methods worked, though worked was often relative. Arrow removal, for example, was a feat dreaded by every wounded archer and footman. Imagine a man kneeling over you, gripping a set of iron hooks or forceps with no cushioning, no design for comfort, only for grip. Removing an arrow was less like plucking a thorn and more like digging for treasure buried deep inside muscle. Sometimes the head had barbs, designed to shred flesh coming out as much as going in. A skilled surgeon might push the arrow all the way through to remove it cleanly. A less skilled one might leave fragments behind, sealing your fate without knowing it. In moments when proper tools or materials were scarce and on the battlefield, scarcity was the rule rather than the exception. Healers turned to the natural world. Moss, of all things, became a makeshift bandage. Thick, absorbent, and readily available, it could be pressed into a wound to slow bleeding. What they did not realize was that certain mosses, particularly sphagnum, have mild antibacterial properties. Through trial and error, medieval healers learned what the forest could provide. Even if they couldn't explain why it helped, there was an improvisational quality to all of it. A fallen knight might have his wound rinsed with wine, padded with moss, and tied with strips of cloth torn from his own tunic. In those moments, medicine was less a science than an act of desperate creativity. And yet, beneath the rough methods and unsteady hands, there was a shared goal to keep a man breathing long enough to see another dawn, even if the odds stood stubbornly against him. If medieval medicine had a single obsession, it was with the flow of blood. Surgeons and physicians believed health depended on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, an idea inherited from ancient Greek and Roman thought. Illness, they reasoned, was caused by an excess or deficiency of one of these fluids, and the cure was simple in theory, devastating in practice. Take away what there was too much of. For blood, this meant bloodletting. The ritual could be performed. For almost anything: fever, swelling, infection, even melancholy. The patient, already weak, would have their veins opened with a small lancet or a leech placed to draw out the supposed excess. To the wounded soldier, it was like fighting a war on two fronts, one against the injury, the other against the cure. Infections worsened, strength ebbed, and yet the belief endured for centuries. Less blood meant more health. For head injuries, the treatments were even more alarming. A procedure known as trepanation involved drilling or scraping a hole into the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. The tools were crude, often little more than hand-cranked augers or sharp chisels, and the patient was awake for the entire ordeal. Pain was constant, the sound of scraping bone unforgettable. And yet, there were rare cases where this brutal technique saved lives, particularly when head trauma caused dangerous swelling. In contrast to these invasive methods, herbal medicine offered glimmers of real hope. Medieval healers knew plants like comfrey, yarrow, and plantain could help wounds knit faster, though they could not explain the chemical reasons. Yarrow, for example, contains compounds that promote clotting. Plantain has anti-inflammatory properties. These remedies were passed down through generations, taught by observation and shared experience rather than written manuals. On the battlefield, a healer's pouch might contain as many sprigs of herbs as knives, and in some cases, the plants worked better than the blades. Still, the line between healing and harm was razor thin. A soldier might leave the healer's hands stitched, bandaged, and alive or pale, bleeding, and closer to death than before. In those moments, trust in the healer was a gamble with everything at stake, and the only certainty was that the treatment would leave its own kind of scar, whether on the body or in the mind. When all other treatments failed, when the flesh was too mangled, the bone too shattered, and the rot too deep, there was one final terrible option: Amputation. In the medieval world, this was not the calculated, sterile operation we imagine today, but a desperate bid to outrun death by cutting away the part it had claimed. Soldiers knew the moment they saw the surgeon approach with the saw that the chances of survival were slim. The grim statistics told their own story. Most who endured the cutting did not live beyond 3 to 5 days, their bodies succumbing to shock, blood loss, or infection. Pain relief, as we understand it, did not exist. There were no sedatives, no anesthetic gases, no morphine, only the faint mercy of unconsciousness if the body collapsed from agony. Patients might be given strong wine or beer beforehand, perhaps a rag soaked in vinegar or spirits to bite down on. Some were simply handed a stick of wood and told to clench their teeth until it splintered. The saws were sharp, the movement swift, but the screams echoed in the memory of everyone present. The surgeon's skill was measured in speed. A slow hand meant prolonged suffering and greater blood loss. Assistants, often other soldiers, would hold the patient down, pinning the thrashing body to the ground or a rough wooden table. The first cut severed flesh, the second reached bone, and then came the grating rasp as the saw bit through. When the limb finally came free, the stump was cauterized with red-hot iron or sealed with a poultice, though neither could truly protect against infection. Despite the horror, amputation was sometimes the only thing standing between a wounded soldier and certain death from gangrene. The rot could creep up from a foot wound to the knee in days, blackening skin and releasing a sickly sweet smell that even hardened veterans could not bear. Cutting early, though cruel, could save a life at least for a while. Yet for many, survival brought its own trials. A missing hand meant the end of a soldier's fighting days. A lost leg could mean the end of his place in the fields. The medieval world was not kind to those who could not work, and every man who limped away from the healer knew he was stepping into a different kind of battle, one against hunger, poverty, and the eyes of a society that often saw a cripple as less than whole. In that way, the surgeon's saw cut more than flesh. It severed a man's place in the life he had once known. In the medieval world, surgery was not an open craft that any willing hand could attempt. Who could legally slice into human flesh was decided not by the patient's need, but by a tangle of laws, guild rules, and religious prohibitions. To operate without permission was to invite heavy fines, imprisonment, or worse charges of sorcery. Barber surgeons held the most visible role in the medical hierarchy. They were the men with red and white poles outside their shops, the colors symbolizing blood and bandages. A customer might walk in for a shave and walk out missing a tooth, stitched up from a knife wound, or bandaged after a crude amputation. These men were the workhorses of urban medicine, practical and unpretentious, trained by apprenticeship rather than university study. A noble might scoff at their humble status, but on the battlefield, a barber surgeon's speed and steady hand could mean the difference between life and death. Military surgeons occupied a more prestigious, though rarer, position. They traveled with armies, treating wounds as they were inflicted, but there were never enough of them. In many kingdoms, a single surgeon might be responsible for hundreds of men, forced to decide who was worth the effort of treatment. Their medical chests were a mix of practical tools, knives, saws, needles, and talismans, or charms for luck. Because skill alone did not always decide survival, monks, on the other hand, practiced healing under entirely different rules. Religious law forbade them from spilling blood, which meant they could not perform surgeries. Instead, monastic healing focused on herbal remedies, balms, and prayer. In the quiet stone infirmaries of monasteries, patients lay not under the saw, but beneath the shadow of a crucifix, their wounds washed with herbal infusions, their recovery entrusted as much to divine will as to the plants growing in the cloister. Gardens, women healers occupied an uncertain and often dangerous space. Midwives, wise women, and herbalists held vast practical knowledge, passed down through generations. They knew which leaves soothed burns, which roots calmed fever, which poultices drew out infection. But their skill came at a price, too much. Success could attract whispers of witchcraft, especially if their remedies outperformed the work of licensed men. A woman who cured a noble's child might be praised as a healer. One who treated a soldier's infected wound in secret could just as easily be dragged before a tribunal. And over it all loomed the power of the medical guild's exclusive, jealously guarded institutions that decided who could call themselves a surgeon. Membership required years of apprenticeship, the approval of masters, and for many, the right family connections. Those outside the guild's favor worked in the shadows, risking the wrath of both law and superstition. It was a system where permission to heal was as valuable as the skill itself, and where many of the most talented hands were forbidden from touching the dying at all. In such a world, a wounded soldier's survival often depended not on the nature of his wound, but on whether the right healer was allowed to touch him. In medieval society, injury and illness were never faced on equal terms. The quality of treatment a soldier received depended less on the severity of his wound and more on the weight of his name and the breadth of his connections. For the noble knight, clad in fine armor and bearing a family crest, the battlefield did not end with blood in the mud. It continued into the care of skilled hands, clean linens, and the best tools a kingdom could offer. For the common foot soldier, survival might mean relying on a fellow fighter with no more training than the experience of binding his own cuts. A noble wounded in battle might be carried away on a litter of sturdy wood, escorted by retainers to a private chamber where a trained surgeon waited. There, with boiled wine, fresh bandages, and perhaps the luxury of rare imported salves, he could expect careful attention. His worth as a warrior and a political asset meant every effort would be made to save him, even if it meant days of work. And costly supplies. The peasant conscript, by contrast, might be left on the field until the fighting ended, his cries drowned out by the clash of steel and the shouts of orders. When help came, it often came from whoever happened to be nearest another soldier, tearing strips from his tunic to bind a wound, or a camp follower pressing moss into the gash. If infection set in, the soldier might be given nothing more than a prayer and a place to lie down. Connections mattered as much as class. A soldier known to have saved his lord's life, or one with kin in the service of a wealthy household, could expect more than the bare minimum. Villages, too, remembered their own. A man who had defended his home in raids might return to find his neighbors pooling what little they had, herbs from the hedgerow, a portion of clean water, a blanket to keep out the cold. But for the stranger, the outsider with no ties, the road to recovery was far more treacherous. Without the protection of a lord or the goodwill of a community, he was often left to fend for himself. In a world where every resource was scarce and every act of charity came at a cost, care was given where it would be remembered and withheld where it would be forgotten. Thus, the fate of a wounded man in the Middle Ages was determined not just by the blade that cut him, but by the invisible lines of loyalty and status that shaped every decision. In the eyes of the era, healing was never simply about medicine, it was about value. And value was measured in bloodlines and allegiance. When the fighting ended and the wounded were too weak to march, the search for shelter began, a grim race against blood loss, cold, and the creeping rot of infection. Yet medieval Europe was not a land brimming with hospitals. The institutions that did exist were few, scattered, and almost always overcrowded. For most soldiers, recovery took place wherever a roof could be found. Whether or not it was meant for the living, churches were often the first refuge, not because they were well-equipped, but because religious law demanded mercy for the suffering. Stone floors became operating tables, pews were pushed aside to make room for pallets of straw, and the air filled with a mix of incense, candle smoke, and the metallic scent of fresh blood. Wounded men might lie just feet from the altar, their groans echoing under the vaulted ceilings as monks moved between them with Bowls of water and herbal infusions, when the churches filled, or when the wounded were too numerous to bring inside barns, became the next best thing. They offered shelter from the wind and rain, but the straw bedding was often old and filthy, crawling with fleas. The warmth was shared with livestock, whose breath mingled with the fevered panting of the injured. Infection thrived in these conditions. Yet for many, it was better than lying exposed to the elements. Some memorial halls or lordly estates opened their doors to soldiers who had served faithfully, but space was precious. Knights and high-ranking men-at-arms took priority, while lesser soldiers were turned away. For those lucky enough to be admitted, there was the comfort of thicker blankets, a fire in the hearth, and servants to bring food. For the rest, the road continued. Monasteries with dedicated infirmaries were rare jewels in the landscape of medieval care. Within their walls, the sick and wounded were treated with a degree of order and cleanliness uncommon for the time. Monks washed wounds, changed linens, and prepared poultices in herb gardens designed for healing. The stillness of monastic life, broken only by prayer, offered the closest thing to peace a soldier might find after the chaos of battle. In the great cities, hospitals like St. Bartholomew's in London tried to serve hundreds with resources meant for a fraction of that number. The halls overflowed with the sick, cots squeezed shoulder to shoulder, the air heavy with the smell of sickness and unwashed bodies. Running such a place was like attempting to feed an army with a single loaf of bread, an act of constant triage, deciding who might live and who was already too far gone. Yet there were towns, especially near battlefields, that barred their gates entirely to the wounded. The fear of plague and pestilence outweighed any sense of charity. To admit a bleeding soldier was to risk the death of dozens more within the walls. For the man left outside, the message was clear: survival would be his own burden to bear. Even when a wounded soldier found shelter, the battle was far from over. Nature itself became an enemy, attacking the body at its weakest. Cold seeped into marrow, slowing the healing of broken bones and numbing the will to live. In winter, frostbite claimed fingers and toes already damaged by sword or spear. In summer, swarms of flies descended on open wounds, laying eggs in the soft flesh before anyone noticed. Their maggots writhing in the rot, sanitation was almost non-existent. In barns, churches, or makeshift tents, waste gathered in corners, fouling the air and poisoning the ground. Water for washing was often the same water used for cooking or drinking, from rivers where animals waded and carcasses rotted. A soldier's bandage might be the same cloth worn for days, stiff with dried blood and grime, changed only when it was so foul it began to crumble. Rats thrived in these conditions. They gnawed through food stores, spread fleas, and carried diseases that could kill more swiftly than any blade. The infamous Black Death had already taught Europe how swiftly plague could burn through a population, and its memory haunted every crowded infirmary. Even the healthiest man could sicken overnight. If the wrong pest found him in his sleep, the elements also conspired against morale. A man lying under a leaking roof during a storm felt each cold droplet as an insult. Wind whistled through gaps in walls, chilling sweat-soaked clothes until they clung like ice. In the heat, wounds swelled and throbbed, the smell of infection rising in the stifling air, until even the strongest stomachs turned. There was no comfort, only degrees of misery. A straw bed might keep a man off the freezing ground, but it also harbored lice and mites. A small fire offered warmth, yet its smoke-filled lungs already weakened by injury. Even food, when it could be spared, was often thin broth hot enough to burn the tongue, too watery to fill the belly. In this fight, there was no enemy to stab, no fortress to storm. The soldier could only endure, clinging to life while the world around him seemed to conspire for his end. Those who survived did so not through strength alone, but through sheer, stubborn defiance, an unspoken refusal to let the cold, the filth, and the gnawing hunger finish what the battlefield had started. Some wounds left no mark on the skin, yet cut deeper than any blade. Men returned from war with all their limbs intact, but carried within them a storm that no surgeon could treat. They woke in the night drenched in sweat, haunted by the memory of screams and the clang of steel. Sudden noises, a dropped pot, a barking dog, could send them scrambling for cover, their hearts racing as if the enemy were upon them again. We know this now as post-traumatic stress disorder. In the Middle Ages, it was something far more misunderstood, and far more dangerous to speak of. To medieval minds, a soldier who could not shake off the horrors of war was weak, morally flawed, or cursed. The Church sometimes whispered of demonic possession, seeing visions and night terrors as signs that the devil had taken root in a man's soul. Others dismissed it as cowardice, a shameful inability to be a man after battle. For the afflicted, this meant there was no help, only judgment, isolation, and the slow erosion of whatever life they had left. Some sought refuge in faith, making long pilgrimages to distant holy sites. They walked for months or years, believing the journey itself could cleanse them of the shadows in their minds. Others joined monasteries, not from spiritual calling, but from a desperate need to escape. Within the thick stone walls, the routines were predictable, the silence deep. Prayers became a kind of therapy, though no one would have called it that. The monastery was, without knowing it, an early asylum for the broken-hearted and battle-worn. Confession sometimes offered relief. Veterans would kneel before a priest and pour out the litany of horrors they had seen and done, villages burned, comrades cut down, enemies begging for mercy in their last moments. For some, speaking the words lifted part of the weight. For others, it only sharpened the pain, forcing them to relive what they wished to forget. Villages rarely understood. A soldier who flinched at the sound of a hammer, or who refused to join in festivities, was mocked, sometimes even feared. Families hid their troubled kin from neighbors to avoid shame. In the worst cases, men were chained or locked away when their behavior turned unpredictable, not out of cruelty, but because no one knew another way. There were no words for trauma, no concept of mental health, no system of care for minds in distress. The broken were left to mend themselves or to fade quietly into obscurity. Those who survived carried their battles within, invisible to all but themselves, until death finally brought them peace. Not every wounded veteran faded into obscurity. Some clawed their way back into usefulness, piecing together a life from what remained of their bodies and skills. Amputees learned to work with wooden crutches, hobbling between furrows in the fields, or using simple prosthetic legs, carved from oak and strapped with leather. The craftsmanship was basic, but for a man with no other options, even an awkward wooden limb could mean the difference between starvation and survival. Lords often found ways to employ loyal veterans whose bodies had been broken in their service. A one-legged guard could still watch the gate, and a one-armed man could still patrol the walls or carry messages. Trust mattered more than physical perfection. An injured retainer was still less likely to betray his master than an untested stranger. Prosthetics for the wealthy were marvels of the age, blending utility with status. Artisans forged iron braces and jointed limbs, not only to restore some function, but to maintain a noble's appearance in court. These devices were heavy, sometimes painfully so, yet wearing them allowed a knight to stand before his peers as something closer to whole. Others turned to teaching. In training camps, scarred veterans became living proof of the dangers of war. Recruits listened closely to a man whose missing fingers told the story of a sword fight gone wrong, or whose limp spoke of a spear thrust in some distant field. Experience gave their words weight, and the visible cost of that experience was a warning as much as an inspiration. Mercenary companies, too, valued the skills of injured soldiers. Men who could no longer fight on the front lines could still serve as quartermasters, strategists, or sentries. A soldier's worth was measured in more than muscle, knowing how to manage supplies, Keep order and read the flow of battle was a skill set that could not be learned in books. For those with less visible injuries, deep scars hidden beneath clothes, or the slow ache of poorly healed bones, ordinary work remained possible. Grain mills needed keepers. City gates needed watchmen. These jobs were modest, but in a world where most people labored from dawn to dusk, they offered stability and a place in the community. Survival was never easy, and dignity was hard won. Every day was a negotiation with pain, every step a reminder of what had been lost. But for those who found a way forward, the struggle itself became proof that they were more than what the war had taken from them. For every wounded soldier who managed to rebuild a life, there were many more who slipped into the shadows, unseen and unwanted. Severe disfigurement was often the cruelest burden. In an age when appearance was believed to reflect the soul, a mangled face or missing nose was more than unsettling. It was a visible brand of misfortune, or worse, divine punishment. Villages shunned such men, not out of malice alone, but from fear, as though the injury itself might be contagious. Families, already struggling to survive, sometimes turned their backs on relatives whose wounds made them unable to work. Love had limits when there was not enough bread to go around. Those without kin or a patron to protect them faced the streets, where life became a constant negotiation for scraps. Many cities passed laws to keep the wounded poor from begging in public. The sight of too many broken men frightened visitors and made merchants fear for their trade. A missing arm or a twisted leg could be a badge of honor in the eyes of fellow soldiers, but to townsfolk, it was a reminder of war's cost, something they preferred not to see. Some veterans, desperate for survival, turned to the road as wandering beggars or bandits. Others sold their swords to foreign lords, signing on for suicidal campaigns in distant lands where their lives were considered expendable from the first march. Hunger, more than loyalty or ambition, drove them into these dangerous bargains. Superstition often made their existence harder still. A wound that never healed, or a sore that refused to close, was seen not as a medical problem, but as proof of sin. Chronic illness was believed to be God's way of marking the guilty, and towns sometimes banished those afflicted from festivals or religious gatherings. Some tried to hide in plain sight, posing as pilgrims to gain food and shelter from charitable hosts, but the disguise rarely lasted. Scars told their own story, and once recognized as soldiers, many were turned away. Without shelter, the winters claimed them. Disease claimed more. The roadsides and churchyards filled with graves marked only by the memory of those who had known them. It was the great paradox of the medieval world. Warriors were praised in song and honored in victory, yet discarded when broken. They were the pride of their lords in life, and the shame of their communities in ruin. The banners under which they had fought would still wave in the wind, long after the men who bled for them were forgotten, buried in unmarked ground, their names lost, their sacrifices remembered only by the silence they left behind.